The Caste War, well, it's a huge topic in the history of Yucatan. It's not ancient history, it continued right up into the 20th century. Its effects are still important today. It's far too large a topic for a single lecture, so tonight I've chosen one small aspect of it, the end. How did the thing finally wind up? And as we'll see, the end is not a simple matter, it's a subject of considerable controversy. I'm going to assume some basic familiarity with the Caste War. I'm sure we've all seen the impressionistic, violent images of the Caste War. This is a mural from Valladolid, and there are also representations in the Castro Pacheco murals off of our main square. I'm going to give a very brief outline just to be sure everybody's up to speed before we get to the end stage. As Scott mentioned, we have a time limit here, and I'm sure Scott is going to enforce it. And so let's save questions and comments until the end, and I'll stay around as long as anybody wants to talk about it. All right, the Caste War. In the 1840s, the independent Republic of Yucatan enacted a lot of reform measures, many of which are really good, progressive measures. And one they did that probably wasn't such a good idea was to encourage the development of industrial agriculture in the eastern part of the peninsula. It was an area that the central government had never really controlled. It was inhabited by Maya people living more or less traditional subsistence agriculture lifestyles. And industrial agriculture would have destroyed their way of life. We can see what that looks like by looking at northern Belize, which is basically a sugarcane monoculture. So this was a real threat for the Maya people in the east. And in the mid-1840s, there were a series of unfortunate, violent events, people killing each other, plenty of guilt to go around on both sides. But anyway, those events and the threat of expropriation of their land triggered a huge rebellion. The people in the east swept to the west with the objective of killing every Ladino on the peninsula or pushing them into the sea. I use the term Ladino to mean people of any ethnic heritage, European, American, African, and all admixtures, who more or less accepted European, Hispanic, Mexican lifestyle. The rebellion, the war, began in summer of 1847, and by spring, the Maya armies were out the outskirts of Mérida and Campeche. All of those towns within the gray area, had more or less been wiped out. The people massacred or forced to flee, looted and burned. Mérida was packed with thousands of refugees. And then in June 1848, the Maya armies suddenly retreated, just left the field. There's a lot of stories about that. Maybe they realized that it was time to plant their cornfields, which they had to do to feed their families, so they went home. Also, their badly planned supply lines were overextended at that point. So anyway, they fell back. And after a few years, the Ladino people in the Yucatan state kind of recovered, breathed huge sighs of relief, repopulated some of these towns, and things had quieted down. And people were starting to lose interest, I guess. And the government in Mérida, in its infinite wisdom, declared the war is over, 1852. So, was the war really over? Well, it would be a short talk if that were true. So this is the first possible end date. Instead, what happened is the thing lapsed into a series of attacks and counterattacks, guerrilla raids and murderous attacks back and forth across a line of contact, which is roughly the boundary with Quintana Roo State and Yucatán State. And this continued with little change for decades. The Yucatan Peninsula during this time lost between 1/3 and 1/2 of its population, if you can believe it, either killed or forced to flee the violence. After its initial success, the Maya people fell back to the east, and there must have been kind of a sense of defeat or weariness. The threat was still there. Their best leaders had been killed. They were a little disorganized. And then in 1850, something happened that led to a great revival and a unification of the rebel Maya in a sense that they'd never had before. This was a new indigenous religion, the Speaking Cross religion. This could be a subject of an entire lecture in itself. This is a big and, I think, interesting subject for me. The rebel Maya, because of their adherence to the Speaking Cross religion, became known as the Cruzop, which is the Spanish word for cross and the Mayan plural ending. I'm going to have to ask you here, rather than talk a lot about this religion, just to accept that this was a real religion, a cross that can speak and deliver prophecies and instructions on proper conduct and political opinions and so forth is a little hard for us to accept. But I would point out that every religion has elements of magic associated with it that its adherents choose to accept and in the name of faith. So this religion met the needs of the people. It was very important in the rest of the story. And I have to ask you to accept this was not some kind of crazy cult run by a bunch of charlatans. It was the real religion and deserves whatever respect we would give to other religions. The Maya people established what was essentially an independent state, an independent nation in that blue shaded area there. They built a capital called Santa Cruz. Its actually name was Nohka Santa Cruz Palamna, but Santa Cruz is good for short. The people there sustained themselves through trade with British Honduras. British Honduras, which is down here. That supplied them with arms that they needed to defend themselves and other supplies. They paid for that with loot they captured from raids from border towns and with money they collected from timber concessions. The British woodcutters were taking tropical hardwoods out of the Rio Hondo area here, and the Maya charged them a concession fee or maybe a protection racket, I don't know. But they were collecting money from that, which was quite important to them. The other colored blotches here, there were a group of Maya people that didn't really participate in the initial war, and they reached kind of an unspoken agreement with the Ladino government that they would stay peaceful and leave each other alone. So they're called the Pacificos. This red one is a violent Maya group called the Icaiche, who are not part of our story, but gave the British a lot of trouble. The Speaking Cross was housed in this building in the center of their capital, Santa Cruz, obviously influenced by Christian church architecture, but the cross was kept in a kind of a secret back room, the Gloria there, and delivered its pronouncements to interpreters. So that's pretty much the background on the Caste War, and I'd like to leave it at that and now move on to talking about the end events in a little more detail. I'll give you a spoiler right away that there was no definitive end. There was no Battle of Waterloo or Appomattox. There was no general surrender or peace treaty. Eek. There's a very large bug crawling there. Oh well. There was a possible and an honorable end to the war in 1884. The British down in British Honduras tried to act as peacemakers, all the while making good money sending weapons to the Maya. And they encouraged negotiations between the Ladino Yucateco state and the Maya Cruzab state. The leader of the Cruzab people at the time was a fellow called Crescencio Pote. I like to have pictures of people in history. It makes it seem more real. They're not just names on the books. This is the only picture I can find of this gentleman. I can't verify its accuracy or its provenance, but anyway, Crescencio Pote's title as the paramount chief or leader of the Cruzab nation was Nohoch Tata, which means great father. So Pote seemed to be more or less inclined toward peace and ending the conflict with the Yucatecos, and he sent a representative to Belize Town to meet and negotiate. He sent one of his top people called Aniceto Tz'ul, and the Yucatecos sent their vice governor, General Teodosio Canto, who, by the way, spoke fluent Mayan, so that was helpful. This is kind of a remarkable photograph of the negotiating team. That's Canto seated in the middle, and the bottom's cut off. Oh well, we can't do anything about that, I guess. Aniceto Tz'ul seated there in white, and that's the British administrator, Henry Fowler, standing on the right. These guys did a great job. They actually reached an agreement on a treaty, a very reasonable sounding thing. It afforded a certain amount of autonomy to the Maya people, let them choose their own leaders, allowed for an exchange of prisoners and things like that. It's possible that the two sides had different understandings of some of the provisions, and there were a lot of details that were not well defined. But it was a good treaty, a great start, and a possible end for the war. However, the day after the negotiations, after this photo was taken, I guess, Aniceto Tz'ul reported to the British that General Canto had become drunk and insulted him. So Tz'ul denounced the treaty, and went back to Santa Cruz in anger. I think there might be a certain amount of truth in that story. However, I think also Tz'ul was probably not in favor of peace and ending the war, because he went back to Santa Cruz, and within a few months he had Crescencio Pote murdered and installed himself as the leader. So he probably took advantage of this chance to sabotage the peace agreement. In the 1890s, the Yucatecan state had a military reawakening. The fighting along the line of contact had been kind of desultory for years. But I think with the new infusion of the Hennigan wealth of that time, they began building up their military in a serious way. And maybe more importantly, they finally agreed that they were never going to end this thing without help from the federal government. So that simultaneously coincided with the president of Mexico, who had been fighting several indigenous revolts around the country. He decided to turn his attention to Yucatan as well. So things came together, and these are the two guys that put the military effort together. President Porfirio Diaz. Diaz appointed Francisco Canton Rosado as the governor of Yucatan. Seems to be the way things were gone. Elections were just annoying formalities. Diaz appointed the governor. Canton was a military man, a long supporter of Diaz. So these two guys got together and agreed to cooperate with the Mexican and Yucatecan forces. Canton, by the way, is the fellow who built the Palacio Canton up in the Paseo here. He had made a lot of money with railroads and other things connected with the Hennigan business. So Mexican and Yucatecan troops established a headquarters for invasion at an abandoned town called Saban, which is on the border of the conflict down near Peto. And troops began building up. This is about 50 miles from Santa Cruz. So let's leave them there for a moment as they build up their troops and prepare for invasion, and turn our attention down to the south end of the front, down to the boundary with British Honduras, the Rio Hondo and Chetumal Bay. It was, of course, realized that key to winning this thing was cutting off the flow of arms to the Maya separatists and intercepting their revenue from the timber cutters. So the federal government appointed a young naval officer to establish a military fort and customs post at the mouth of the Rio Hondo on the border with British Honduras. Some of these old photographs are pretty fuzzy. I'm sorry, it's the best we can do. Sub-Lieutenant Tomás Otón Pompeo Blanco. I guess because he was a Navy man, he decided he preferred a floating fort instead of one based on land. And he supervised construction of a suitable vessel in New Orleans. This is a scheme of it. This was an unpowered barge, kind of a tub-like thing. But it turned out to be a game changer in this war. It was made out of cypress planks with an armor-protected deck, 62 feet long, 24 wide, shallow draft, less than 3 feet. It had a single mast that supported an armored crow's nest. Had a crew of 13. They were armed with Winchester repeating rifles and a few pistols. And most importantly, they had a rapid fire cannon on board. I guess we can see it here in this sketch at the I don't know, that's the bow or the stern. Maybe that's the bow. This was it's a picture of the gun. It was a rapid fire Hotchkiss 3-pound cannon here in a naval mount. That's a British crew, but that's what the gun looked like. So this is pretty powerful stuff for this part of the world. Blanco had this armored barge towed to Belize-town, and he was somehow able to convince the British authorities to allow him to pass through to Mexican territory. And on January 22nd, 1898, this vessel, which had been, which had been commissioned a naval ship in the Mexican Navy, the Chetumal. This is the best picture I've been able to find of it. It was towed into Chetumal Bay and took up station at the mouth of the Rio Hondo, 300 feet off the Mexican shore. Very quickly, Blanco received a message from his Maya opponents that he and his crew should depart immediately or, quote, have their skulls converted to drinking cups. Blanco was not intimidated, though, and he realized that what he really needed to hold the strategic position was a settlement on the land with some population. So he recruited some Mexican refugees from northern British Honduras, of which there were many. And under protection of his naval force, the new settlers came in and founded a town on the left bank of the Rio Hondo. They cleared the brush and laid out sand streets and constructed temporary residences, built a pier, put up a flagpole. They called the place Payo Obispo after a bishop in the 16th century who was reported to visit the location, and he went on to become prominent in later years. Payo Obispo. This is the earliest representation I've found of the name on a map right there. It's like a hand-drawn map from about the time of its foundation. There's the Rio Hondo. This would be British Honduras, and this would be the Maya state up here. Well, the town and the armored barge effectively intercepted the flow of arms to the Maya people and cut off their timber revenue. So this is a real game changer. Back in the north, President Diaz appointed a general to take charge of the invasion effort. It was General Ignacio Bravo. Oh, his name is cut off there. Well, Bravo was a small 70-year-old man with an enormous drooping white mustache, and he had earned his right to take over this job by his genocidal attacks against the Yaqui people in Sonora. A serious troop buildup began in Saban. 7 battalions of Mexican regulars and 3 of the state militia. This is a view of the combined army as it began moving out of Saban into a series of camps. And I think it's useful at this point to look at the Maya opposition. I think this is a remarkable picture of a military review in Santa Cruz with the Maya soldiers. I have no idea how we came to have this photo. It's in the INA archives. Somebody took it. As you can see, they don't have the mules and wagons that the Mexican forces did. I think their lineup might be straighter, though. They had the advantage of superior numbers, and they were certainly well motivated to defend their homeland against the invaders. I think we need to look at the arms that the two sides had here. I'm not usually much of a gun guy, but we need to understand what they were fighting with. It's important. For the Maya soldiers, all through this whole war, their most effective weapon was the machete, which was terribly effective in ambushes and close combat. They also had a collection of ancient muzzle loaders and shotguns and such. And from the British, they had obtained Winchester hunting rifles and some military rifles. Most of these were the kind of semi-obsolete single-shot Martini Henry rifles, probably left over from the Zulu War. They had some other newer, up-to-date weapons, Enfield rifles, which is a good military rifle. It continued in use right through the First World War. However, the Maya people were continuously short of ammunition, so that was a problem for them. On the other hand, the Mexican Yucatecan forces were very well supplied with modern weapons. The main rifle the troops used was the Mauser 5-shot bolt-action rifle. It's a great weapon. This was the main weapon through the First World War, into the Spanish Civil War, and into the Second World War in sub-armies, so a very good weapon. They also had, if you can believe it, some machine guns. Probably the French mitrailleuse machine gun, a very odd-looking thing. It has 25 separate barrels that could be fired in sequence by turning a crank. This is frankly not a very good weapon. The French gave it up after the Franco-Prussian War, but they had some of these. What we think of as a machine gun now, the single barrel thing that's automatic and recoil operated, had been invented, a fellow called Maxim in Britain, but it wasn't in Mexico yet. So they had a few of these odd-looking machine guns. Most importantly, they had field artillery. This is a French Debanche field gun being loaded here by a French soldier. But this was a really game-changing weapon that the Mexican Yucatecan forces had. So Bravo was very well supplied. He progressed toward Santa Cruz, his target, by building a good road with wide clear cuts on both sides to prevent ambushes. He established strong points along the way connected by telegraph lines to prevent surprise attacks. It was essentially a construction project, with the military protecting the work gangs as they built the road and cleared the trees. And of course the state government pouring in money all the time. The Maya first opposed, this is the route that he was taking toward Santa Cruz. I meant to show the Maya opposed Bravo for the first time on December 27th, 1899. They found their machetes didn't work very well against these wide clear cuts, and the dry stone walls that they had used for protection didn't stand up very well against artillery fire. So Bravo's army in 4 months advanced 30 miles towards Santa Cruz. At the same time, then in May 1900, the rainy season hit. And we know what that's like. It made the supply routes impassable. And at the same time, a severe measles epidemic hit the Maya people. So things kind of came to a stop for some months. They resumed when things dried out in early 1901. And the Maya attacked in force, but were unable to stop the advance of Bravo's army. There was a simultaneous naval advance from the base down on Chetumal Bay. The forces reoccupied the abandoned and ruined Spanish fort at Bacalar and moved north against light resistance. There were also naval landings, most importantly up here on Asuncion Bay at basically a sandbar called Villa Chico. There were also landings at Tulum and down here on this peninsula seaward from Chetumal Bay, the Xcalac Peninsula, which was basically empty at that time. Now there's a lot of tourist development going on down there. So the Maya nation was surrounded, and they abandoned their capital at Santa Cruz, took the cross with them, and went out to hide in the forest. On May 4th, 1901, Bravo's troops marched unopposed into abandoned Santa Cruz and established the official end date for the war. Official in heavy quotation marks. Bravo announced his great victory by telegraph, and the next day wild celebrations broke out in Merida. The war was over after 54 years of horrible violence. Governor Canton ordered the name of the town changed to Santa Cruz de Bravo to honor the victorious general. And a few weeks later, he actually came for a visit to visit the conquered enemy capital. And I really like this photograph. This is a military lineup for review by the governor. We see the Mexican Yucatecan troops in the dark uniforms in their full field packs. The officers in dress white uniforms. Down here is the artillery and the ammunition boxes. And way up the top here are the Maya laborers who built the road and cut the trees. A large faction of the Cruzal people who abandoned Santa Cruz started a new settlement about 30 miles away. It's about a group of about 700 people. They built a place which they called Guardia. They built a new sanctuary for the cross, that thatched roof building. They built barracks and laid out boundaries which they marked with crosses, established a series of rotating guards to patrol the perimeter and keep out all outsiders. Those are pretty tough looking guys, looks like to me. So this refuge and other refuges out in the forest were populated by the rebels who had now become refugees, and they continued the war, a guerrilla war. Some of them were offered terms, but few accepted, and there was no general surrender or amnesty of any kind. Well, Yucatan, did they get back their lost part of the state that had been taken away by the rebellion? Well, no, Diaz had other ideas. He created a new territory named after a local hero of the Mexican War of Independence, Andres Quintana Roo. There were howls of protest from Yucatan, who had a big slice of their state taken away. Bravo was the absolute ruler of this new territory. He ruled it with an iron fist. If we could see the details of this, we would see that there's only two towns worth mentioning here. Oops. Santa Cruz de Bravo, which is here, and Payo Obispo down here. The rest of it was pretty much enemy territory still, Maya territory. Bravo tried to fix up his capital city. He created a nice plaza, planted it with orange trees, created a modern market and water reservoir, put up an electrical generator, and he constructed a railroad from Santa Cruz up to that miserable landing place on Asuncion Bay, Villa Chico, 35 miles. He used the narrow gauge Decauville prefab railroad that the Henneken plantations had been using. It looked like this, very narrow gauge, under 2 feet. Every time this ran, it needed military protection to prevent Maya attacks and snipers shooting at them from the woods. In Santa Cruz, this is the great Balamna sanctuary. It looks like it's falling into disrepair. Bravo used this as a prison dormitory, which must have been chaotic. He had, in spite of all his improvements, there was very little natural immigration to the new territory or the town. Yucatecans viewed it as a tropical hell. Nobody wanted to go there. Bravo brought in lots of prisoners to do the work. Political prisoners condemned to hard labor, and a lot of military to keep order. The place was essentially a big penal colony. Bravo's administration continued for 11 years. Hell of a mustache. His systematic persecution of the Maya people did nothing but increase their resistance. And now I have for you yet another end of the war. In 1915, the revolution came to Yucatan, finally, in the person of General Salvador Alvarado. Oh, I'm sorry, all the captions are cut off here. But Alvarado was a good guy. He did a lot of reforms, a real hero in my book. Made sweeping changes. He tossed out General Bravo, ended his private empire down there. He released the prisoners, brought the troops home, and ordered all non-Maya people to leave Santa Cruz. He moved the territorial capital to Payo Obispo. So Alvarado officially declared the war is over, the Maya can have their place back again, that's it. Well, the Maya people, the Cruzov Maya, might have welcomed a return to their capital. However, a severe smallpox epidemic hit about then, so return was kind of gradual. Recovery was slow. The faction that reoccupied Santa Cruz finally was under the leadership of Francisco Maypech, whose title we can halfway see was Halachwinik, which means real man in Mayan. It's still a title that's used in Maya groups. Maya's people were not happy with the improvements that they found in their capital, and they set about erasing it. They uprooted the orange trees, blew up the market and reservoir with dynamite, destroyed the generator, cut the telegraph lines, ripped up the railroad, burned the military barracks. They found that their great sanctuary had been desecrated beyond possible recovery. This is a photograph today of what it looks like. The restored sanctuary is the pink building, and Maya ordered construction of a new, smaller chapel next door to be the sanctuary of the cross, which is the yellow building there. So this officially sanctioned separation of the two ethnic groups had major effect, continuing today, on the history of Quintana Roo. The Maya separatists didn't want anything from the Mexicans. They wanted isolation. Peace treaties were meaningless. The Mexican government made serious efforts to bring General May on board and to encourage him to accept Mexican authority. They eventually brought him to Mexico City, where he was made a general in the Mexican army and given a fancy uniform. He met the president, Venustiano Carranza, and was presented with a military review complete with airplanes Wow. My returned home to Santa Cruz, and I'm sure he was much impressed, but ended up voting for isolation to continue and went back to hoeing his milpa. How are we doing on time? In 1917, there was a series of events that had a big effect on the separatist Maya people and led them toward pacification and reconciliation. This was the harvesting and sale of chicle. This is a chiclero, harvesting the sap from a sapote tree, which was collected and boiled down to make a resin, which was the principal ingredient in chewing gum, which was becoming very popular in the United States at the time. Here's an advertising poster that actually recognizes the origin of this stuff. This chicle was replaced some years ago with synthetic rubber, so it's no longer a big commercial item. General Mai took firm control of the chicle business and collected fees from concessionaires, and it wasn't long until the Maya people learned the trade themselves. This is a camp in the forest where the workers are boiling down the sap to make the resin. The sap was collected in, and still is for the people who are involved with this, collected in canvas bags like this and boiled down to make the resin. Well, pretty soon the Maya people were making some real money, cash money, for the first time. And of course this attracted commercial interests, traders and merchants. And the Maya people discovered that their needs had expanded beyond the traditional shotguns and salt to include things like liquor and jewelry and canned food and silk shirts and cigarettes. So they were being seduced into the world of commercial activities, the world of the foreigners. Inevitably, some conflict arose between the chicleros and the concessionaires and the local people and Mai's government, and some Mexican soldiers came in to keep peace. Well, Mai, who had become rich by local standards, accepted that incursion as necessary to keep the peace and keep the chicle trade going. Some of his more militant associates considered him a traitor for this and left. There was a large exodus from Santa Cruz. People went out and started new settlements out in the Campo to maintain their separation and keep the guerrilla war going. In the 1920s and 30s, central Quintana Roo was isolated and self-contained in a way that is difficult to imagine today. There was nothing but the Maya, the separatist Maya, really ruled the backcountry. Invariably, as civil control advanced, there were conflicts. This is the soldiers in the 1930s in Guardia, which was kind of the center of the resistance movement, I guess, who refused to acknowledge Mexican authority. So now I have yet another end date for you, 1933, or at last the last battle of the war. There was a town called Tula, not far from Xcacal, and there were rumors of uprising and unrest there, and some Mexican troops came in to arrest the alleged leader of the trouble, a fellow called Evaristo Sulub. As far as I know, this is the only authentic photograph of Mr. Sulub. This town, Tula, had never recognized Mexican authority. And there was a brief battle, a little more than a skirmish, I guess. 5 Maya and 2 Mexican troops were killed, and the village was burned, and Mr. Salub escaped. Historians regard this as the last battle of the Caste War, Sula. Another possible end more than 85 years after it began. It still wasn't the end, though, and there were some curious incidents up into the 1930s involving a prominent North American archaeologist, Sylvanus Morley, who in this distorted picture is the fellow on the left there. I don't think he was really that thin. He had been plundering around Yucatán for years trying to find archaeological sites and had established contact with some of the isolationist Maya and earned a certain amount of trust with them. And they pestered him for years to supply them with arms they could use to fight the Mexicans. In 1935, a delegation from Xcacal came to Chichen Itza, where Morley was working on the Carnegie project to excavate the site. And we see him here on the left, and Mexican archaeologist Alfonso Villarrojas on the right, and the 2 guys from Xcacal in the middle. Whose name were Concepcion Quituk and our friend Avristo Sulup, number 3. They wanted not only weapons, but they wanted U.S. flags they could put up to demonstrate they were not part of Mexico. As a matter of fact, in 1939, they officially requested that the United States annex their territory. Morley gave them ambiguous answers and didn't get involved. Okay, I have one more. I promise this is the last possible end. During the 1930s, some of the local separatist Maya groups were signing limited documents and letters of understanding recognizing Mexican authority. And in 1935, General Mai himself signed off on one. So this was the last guy who could have been regarded as the top person in the Krusov nation, and he signed off. So 1935. But recalcitrant separatists remained in control of a lot of the backcountry in Quintana Roo, still refusing to consider themselves Mexicans. And through the years up into the 1990s and later, occasional visitors, such as ethnographers, I guess, reported observations from the separatist villages. This is the way the sanctuary at Xcacal looks today. It was still maintained as a sanctuary for the cross. It was worshipped and protected. There's still a scribe there, an escribiano, who interprets the cross and maintains a book of prophecy. Observers had a lot of requests for rifles to drive out the Mexicans. They noted a British flag flying over Xcacal Guardia in the 1970s. Remote Krusov villages still existed who believed the Caste War was still going on and expected eventually to receive help from the Americans and or the British. I think they kind of confused the two. I guess all these English-speaking white guys look the same. But that was happening as late as 1997. And here's one for you that's even more recent, less than 3 years ago, folks. The president of Mexico, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, came to Teosuco, of all places. Teosuco was kind of the ground zero for the beginning of the Caste War. But he came there and gave a speech in which he apologized to the Maya people for the destruction his train was going to cause in their country. Well, this was quickly rejected. The apology was rejected, and a Maya advocacy and support group that's part of the National Indigenous Council sent him a letter. The spokesman for the group sent him a letter that contained these sentences. I must tell you, President, that the memories of the Caste War are still present in the mind of my grandparents. We demand capitalist development be stopped. We demand the right to respect and the right to exercise our autonomies. The same kind of demands they were making in the 1840s, and this was in 2021. So nobody's forgot about this thing. It brings us up to today. The Caste War has ended, but clearly is a memory and immediate historical reality. I'd like, before I wrap this up, are you going to stop me? Okay. I'd like to do a brief epilogue, some of the places and people we've heard about. Santa Cruz had its name changed in the 1930s to Felipe Carrillo Puerto in honor of the murdered governor, and Payo Obispo was changed to Chetumal. There was a governor of Quintana Roo territory at the time. This was a anti-clerical period in Mexico, and he vowed to erase all place names that had any religious connotation, so those were changed. Oton Blanco, the fellow that built the floating fort, went on to a great naval career. He became a vice admiral, undersecretary of the Navy, and he died in 1959 at age 92. The floating barge Chetumal remains on station. It's sunk and covered with mud at the mouth of the Rio Hondo, but it's still there. Francisco May lived on in Santa Cruz, or Carrillo Puerto, until he died in 1969. Not that long ago, folks. He was 90 years old. He's a controversial but mostly honored figure who helped the transition from isolation to peacetime. The Balamna Sanctuary is still there, dominates the center of town, Carrillo Puerto. After it was a sanctuary and a prison, it was a stable, a store, a movie theater, a Masonic lodge, and now it's a Catholic church. Calaguardia is still there. It's right off of Highway 295, about 30 miles from Carrillo Puerto. There's no highway signs that mark the turnoff or identify the place, and I don't know what kind of reception the stray tourist might find there. The cross is still worshipped. It's changed a lot. There's a government school there, but there's still an official notary who looks after the cross. So when did it end? Did it end? Well, let's hope it ended. It was a terrible thing. It resulted in horrible violence across the peninsula. The Maya didn't win, but they did accomplish some of their objectives. They prevented industrial agriculture taking away their land, and they preserved their culture. It's still here to a large extent. I will mention that Maya prophecy regards history as cyclic, and in that tradition, the present time may be a time of relative peace, but subjugation will come again, and the cross will give a signal to rise up and drive out the foreigners. So events in history don't so much as end as come around again the next time. So that's my story, folks. I'll be glad to take comments and questions. And before I end it up, I'll give a very brief commercial message. If you're interested in Yucatan history, you might think about picking up a copy of this book, which is for sale back there.
Well, thanks.
Thank you.